You're probably no stranger to the concept of debt, whether it's financial, emotional, or psychological. But have you ever stopped to think about the emotional debt you may be carrying around, and how it's affecting your life?
This kind of debt can be just as crippling as financial debt, but it's often much harder to recognize and pay off.
Let's take a look at a study by Daniel Goleman, a psychologist who has spent years researching emotional intelligence. In his work, Goleman has shown that people who are more emotionally intelligent are better able to manage their emotions, empathize with others, and build strong relationships. But what about those of us who struggle with emotional debt? Goleman's research suggests that we may be more prone to anxiety, depression, and other mental health issues.
You're watching Mind Unlocked, where we decode the hidden patterns of the human mind.
Now, let's dive deeper into the concept of emotional debt. The psychologist John Bowlby first outlined attachment theory in the 1950s, showing that the bond a child forms with a primary caregiver shapes emotional responses for decades afterward. A child who learns that expressing sadness leads to rejection will carry a specific emotional ledger into adulthood, suppress feelings now, pay interest later. Bowlby's research at the Tavistock Clinic in London documented that adults with insecure attachment styles reported higher rates of chronic resentment and difficulty trusting partners, both hallmarks of accumulated emotional debt. And here is the part that hits close to home: emotional debt can be passed down from generation to generation, just like financial debt. If you grew up in a household where emotions were never really discussed or validated, you may be more likely to struggle with emotional debt as an adult. You have probably done this: you've taken on someone else's emotional burden, or carried around a grudge for years, without even realizing it.
It's like having a credit card with a huge balance that you can't pay off, but instead of money, you're paying in emotions.
The shift in perspective comes when you start to recognize the ways in which emotional debt is affecting your life. Are you constantly feeling drained or resentful? Do you have trouble forming healthy relationships or setting boundaries? These are all signs that you may be carrying around a heavy load of emotional debt. So what can you do about it? The first step is to acknowledge the debt and start making payments, not in the form of money, but in the form of self-care, self-compassion, and emotional awareness. Think about that for a second. Emotional debt is not something that you can just pay off overnight, but it is something that you can start working on today. By becoming more aware of your emotions and taking small steps to manage them, you can start to chip away at that debt and build a more positive, resilient you. And the research goes even further. Studies have shown that people who practice mindfulness, meditation, and other forms of self-care are better able to manage their emotional debt and improve their overall well-being. Robert Kiyosaki, the author of Rich Dad Poor Dad, draws a sharp line between assets and liabilities. An asset puts value back into your life, a liability quietly drains it. That framework maps directly onto emotional debt. Every unspoken resentment, every favor you said yes to when your body screamed no, sits on the liability side of your personal balance sheet. Kiyosaki himself has talked about how his early relationship with his biological father was marked by financial stress that bled into emotional distance, and how it took years to separate the money story from the feeling story underneath it. The lesson is useful: until you audit your emotional liabilities the same way you would audit a bank statement, you cannot know what you actually owe yourself. One of the most common ways people avoid confronting emotional debt is through numbing. Alcohol, nicotine, cannabis, endless scrolling, binge eating, they all serve the same function: they push the payment date further into the future while the interest compounds. A widely shared account online documented what happened after a full year without nicotine, alcohol, or weed. The person reported that the first 90 days were brutal, not because of physical withdrawal, but because every emotion they had been suppressing with substances came flooding back at once. By month 6, they described a clarity they had not felt since childhood. The takeaway was stark: the substances were never the problem.
They were the minimum monthly payment on a debt that kept growing behind the scenes.
You have probably heard of the concept of emotional contagion, the idea that emotions can be passed from one person to another, like a virus. But what about emotional debt? Can that be passed on too? The answer is yes. When we carry around emotional debt, we can inadvertently pass it on to others, whether it's through our words, actions, or even just our presence. This is why it's so important to start working on your emotional debt, not just for your own sake, but for the sake of those around you. Loneliness is often the late fee on unpaid emotional debt. One person described solving loneliness after years of social isolation linked to being on the autism spectrum. Their method was not a grand social strategy. They started by showing up to the same small event every week, a board game night at a local library, and simply tolerating the discomfort of being around people without performing for them. After 4 months, they had 2 genuine friendships, the first in nearly a decade. What made the difference was not charm or social skill. It was the willingness to sit with the awkwardness rather than flee from it. That awkwardness was emotional debt surfacing, and they chose to face the bill instead of deferring it again. The technical mechanism of emotional debt is complex, but it's essentially a cycle of negative emotions that can be difficult to break. When we experience a traumatic or stressful event, our body's fight or flight response is triggered, releasing stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. If we don't find a way to process and release these emotions, they can become stuck in our body, leading to chronic stress and anxiety. This is why it's so important to find healthy ways to manage our emotions, whether it's through exercise, meditation, or talking to a therapist. In 1983, sociologist Arlie Hochschild published The Managed Heart, introducing the term emotional labor. Hochschild studied flight attendants and bill collectors and found that workers required to suppress or manufacture emotions on the job experienced higher rates of burnout, substance use, and emotional numbness at home.
Her research revealed that the average flight attendant performed roughly 12 distinct emotional adjustments per hour during a shift.
That constant performance creates a specific kind of debt. You spend emotional currency at work and come home bankrupt. Decades later, therapists still use Hochschild's framework to help clients recognize that their exhaustion is not laziness, it is an overdrawn emotional account.
A 2015 study published in the journal Psychosomatic Medicine tracked over 600 adults for 5 years and found that those who reported consistently suppressing negative emotions had a 40% higher risk of all-cause mortality compared to those who processed their feelings openly.
The researchers controlled for smoking, diet, and exercise, meaning the effect was not explained by other health behaviors. Emotional debt does not just make you feel bad. It can shorten your life. The lead author, a psychologist at Chapman University named Sarah Pressman, noted that emotional suppression appears to place chronic low-grade stress on the cardiovascular system, raising resting blood pressure and inflammatory markers over time. And the research goes even further. Studies have shown that people who practice gratitude and positivity are better able to manage their emotional debt and improve their overall well-being. This is not to say that you should just think positive and ignore your negative emotions, but rather, that you should find healthy ways to balance your emotions and cultivate a more positive outlook. You can start by keeping a gratitude journal, or practicing mindfulness and meditation. You can also start to reframe your negative thoughts and focus on the positive aspects of your life. If you want a concrete place to start, consider a simple list that has circulated widely in self-improvement communities: 16 small daily actions linked to a higher quality of life. Among them are drinking enough water, moving your body for at least 30 minutes, spending 10 minutes in silence, and writing down 3 things you are grateful for before bed. None of these cost money. None require a therapist. But together they function like consistent minimum payments on your emotional debt. The people who report the biggest transformations are not the ones who overhauled everything overnight. They are the ones who picked 2 or 3 items from that list and did them every single day for 6 months without stopping. Consistency is the repayment plan. Small, boring, daily deposits of self-respect that eventually tip the balance from deficit to surplus. Subscribe to Mind Unlocked. Next video, the one word that predicts whether someone respects you.